Welcome everybody on this Monday afternoon to the Learn Fair Isle class featuring the Checkmate Sweater. Hopefully that's what you're all here for anyway. Darren is your instructor. He's there on screen showing off his little swatch of the motif from this sweater. We will be covering some Fair Isle basics, both this sweater, which is knit with Fair Isle flat, which is a little bit different than the traditional working it in the round. And so we'll cover some techniques for that and how to read the chart and manage your yarn. And then after this class, you'll have all the skills you need to make that sweater. What we're not going to cover is sort of the rest of the sweater construction. That is too much to fit in 1 hour. So it's pretty straightforward though. So you can figure that out. We have faith in you. My name's Claire. I'll be hanging out in the chat in Zoom and I can answer your questions directly there, or I will forward them on to Darren. And I can also put the pattern in the chat in case you didn't get that already. And reminder, this class is being recorded, so if you need to go back and watch it again, you can do so starting tomorrow afternoon on michaels.com/classes or the Michaels YouTube channel. And with all of that out of the way, I will let Darren take over.
Okay, welcome to class. And just as Claire said, today we're going to be reviewing some Fair Isle basics. And this is just going to be a little different. Traditionally, Fair Isle is usually worked in the round. But today we're going to show you how to work Fair Isle flat. And if you have experience with Fair Isle, it's really not much different. I mean, there's really almost like no difference at all. But if you don't have any experience with Fair Isle, then you can look at both ways of doing it and then kind of make a decision. And if you want to make the Checkmate sweater, then it's the perfect opportunity to try it out because that one is knitted flat and then seamed. I'm going to talk about the differences and some pros and cons of each way of doing it. So there's always, good and bad reasons of doing something. So if we want to go ahead and switch the camera to the view of my hands, go ahead and get started. Find my glasses. So I don't know if anyone's experienced with knitting in the round, but when you're knitting in the round on something like a hat, what happens is you cast on and then you're knitting, you're just like it says, you're knitting in the round. So you're just going round and round. And you're only ever looking at the front of your work. So you're never turning and going back. You're knitting it in this kind of a way. So you're always looking at the front. And that makes it a little bit easier to do Fair Isle because you can keep track of where you are in your chart. You can see where it is a little bit easier, and that is more, it's a little beneficial. But sometimes we tend to forget about the floats. So you do need to pay attention to what's going on both sides of your fabric. So just because you're looking at one side while you're knitting it, you always have to remember, I am also working on the other side. So you do have to make sure you're being careful to work on both sides of your fabric at once and make sure things are going right. And if you knit flat, of course, I've already bound this off, but what you're doing is you're going across. You finish your row, you turn your work, and then you come back across the other way, turn your work. So in that fashion, you will be working on the front of your work and able to see exactly how your Fair Isle is turning out. You turn your work, and it's a little harder to see what you're doing. It's not as hard as you might think, because these floats do kind of block your vision. But as you're working across, you have an opportunity to look at your floats and just make sure that you're keeping them nice and neat and that you're not making them too tight or too loose, because that can have problems later on. So that's the best kind of visual for showing the difference of working Fair Isle flat or working it in the round. And we're going to talk a little bit more as we progress about some of the pros and cons of it. And just a little bit about Fair Isle in general, or stranded knitting. Fair Isle is a very, very specific technique. So with Fair Isle, you have a lot of rules you have to follow. They only have 2 colors in each row for Fair Isle. Fair Isle is usually worked up in kind of a striping motif. Fair Isle doesn't usually create a picture. So the Checkmate Sweater technically would be more of a stranded knitting project, not a true Fair Isle project. But it's all done basically the same way, but sometimes, it's nice to know the specific terms. But when you're working on Fair Isle, one of the first things you want to do is pick yarn that has a very strong contrast, because you're going to be doing a lot of extra work and you want to make sure you're getting credit for all the work you're doing. So as you can see on my little swatch here, down here where this dark burgundy is, I did some dark burgundy and gray, and you can hardly see it. So that's probably not a good choice, because you're going to do a lot of work and it's not going to show up. So then I switched to the brighter red, and it's the same color gray. And now you can see it shows up very nicely. So, and then when I switch to the white, it gives me a very, very bright contrast, as so like similar to this hat was done in the same with the red and the white. And you can see it's a very, very stark contrast. If this whole project would have been done with this gray and burgundy, then you may as well just do a solid color and not do all the extra work. So picking the right color contrast is a nice option. Sometimes if you take a picture of the yarn you're considering, like on your phone, and then change that picture to black and white, if there's still a nice contrast between the black and the two yarn choices on a black and white photo, that's a good idea. It gives you a good idea that there will be a nice contrast between them. Usually in a traditional Fair Isle, you use a wool or a fuzzy yarn, but that's not always necessary. And today we're going to kind of step out of that little box and show you how to do Fair Isle. And we're going to be using TRUBOO, which is a bamboo yarn. So it's very nice. So you don't have to get caught up in rules and follow traditions. Don't be afraid to try something new and kind of, take it in a new direction. So any questions so far about anything we're talking about?
Everybody liked your tip on the photography. I think that's a good one to use.
Okay. So I started this little swatch. So just to show you a little bit about how Fair Isle actually works. When I knit, I hold the yarn in my left hand. So I like to hold both strands of yarn in my left hand, and I hold them like this and keep them separated by wrapping them in between two different fingers. And then you just make a stitch. You can choose red, or you can choose blue. And then you can do blue as many times as the chart calls for, and then do red. You don't have to do it that way. You can hold them both in your right hand, which I don't knit as much with my right hand, so I'm not as good at it. So like with this, you can choose red, and then you can choose blue, and you can do whatever the chart is calling for. Another way of doing it is to hold one in each hand. And so if you practice British knitting and continental knitting and get reasonably good at both, then you can hold one color in each hand, and it helps to keep them from getting tangled up. So you can choose red, and you can choose blue. Now I think this is a really good choice, and I always want to do it this way, and I'll start out like this, but by the end of the row, I have both of them in my left hand. So it just doesn't seem to work out for me. So I always end up with both of them back in my left hand, not really realizing how I did that. So, but lots of different ways of doing it. You can also just drop both of the strands of yarn and kind of drop them as you're not using them. So I'm going to use red, and I'm just gonna let that drop, and then I'm going to use blue. So that way you're only holding one at a time, but this is going to be quite slow. But if you're practicing, maybe it's okay. So good different options of holding the yarn. You want to make sure, so these strands of yarn in the back are called floats, and I've already referenced them a few times, but when you're not using a color, you're dragging it along the back and it creates this horizontal bar in the back of your work, and it's called a float. Now you really want to practice making sure that these floats are not too tight and they're not too loose. If they're very, very tight, it'll cause your work to pull in and be very tight, and it'll pucker on the other side. It'll look kind of like this. And it's not, even if you block it, it's not going to block out because the floats are too tight and they won't be able to stretch. And if you have them very, very loose, what will happen? So this stitch right here is very loose because I'm not sure why that one's so loose, but that's what happens if you let your floats be very loose. Then some of the extra slack of the float will kind of work its way to the front, and it'll make your stitches very, very loose. And it can also affect your gauge, because if the stitches are loose, it can make your gauge a little bit larger. So that's something to be careful about. And it takes practice, just managing your floats. You really have to, do you have a good trick for that, Claire? Or is it just, I always think it just takes practice. It's not so hard. What do you think?
It just takes practice, like a lot of things in knitting do. Yes.
Fortunately. So you don't want to pull them really tight. So like just kind of let it rest gently in your hand. When you're working, you don't want to let your work, sometimes when I'm knitting, I let my work kind of bunch up in my hand like that. And normally that's fine. But when you're doing Fair Isle or stranded knitting, you don't want that to happen. You want to stretch your work out, and then that'll give the floats the opportunity to stretch out. And we're not trying to stretch them out too far because that'll make the floats too long. So you just want to have it kind of stretched out so that the fabric is comfortable the way it's going to look when it's finished. And it's not a bad idea to give it a little snug like this every now and then to kind of pull just a little bit of that tightness out of it. So that's a couple of ways you can try to keep it from being too tight, right? Any questions about managing the floats?
We do have one question about how you would manage the yarn if it's going to be a very long float. Say if it's going to be like more than 4 or 5 stitches long.
Perfect question. And I'm knitting this swatch is flat, but I'm pretending it's in the round. And this is one way of doing a swatch when you're doing a sweater in the round and you don't want to knit in the round necessarily for the swatch because you want to do a smaller swatch. You just knit on the front, and instead of purling back, you bring your yarn to the other side, and then you're ready to knit the other one. And the reason you do that is because if you're knitting flat, you want to do your swatch flat. And if you're knitting in the round, you have to do your swatch in the round because that will it can affect your gauge. So that is any questions about that? That might be a little confusing. I can clarify it if you want me to.
I think we could probably go back to that after we talk about the float management a little bit.
So normally in Fair Isle, you don't want to have floats that are going to be much longer than, that are going to be much longer than 5 stitches. If they're going further than 5 stitches, you're going to want to, it's called catching the float or trapping it. And let me show you how to do that. So I'm going to start with, add this mustard color in. And then pick up my red. Do 2 red just for fun. I'm not following the chart, I'm just practicing. And so now I'm going to do 3 more red. So 1, 2, 3, 4. I have a total of 5 red. So once you get to this point, if my chart called for like 3 or 4 or 5 more red, you don't want to have this gold floating that far. Because what will happen is if you try to put on a sweater or even a hat, you might get it caught on a ring or a bracelet and pull it, and it'll cause a snag in the front of your work. It can cause lots of problems. So what you want to do is go ahead and enter your stitch like you're going to knit. And then I just take my 2 strands of yarn and then just twist them. So what happens is that red one and that yellow one get twisted together, and it holds it in place. It kind of traps it down, and then you don't have such a long float. So you can see right here, it's trapped in place. Can you tell that for sure? You can see right there, the red yarn overlapping it. So let me do a couple more red ones. Okay, now I'm going to twist it again. Oops, I'm almost out of red yarn. Twist it again. And then I'm going to pick up the strand. So any questions on that? Let's see it again. And I like to twist mine every like 3 or 4. I don't even usually go 5. So twist it, just one twist. It's just gonna hold it in place. Claire, how far do you go without twisting?
I usually go 5. I might even push it to 6 if I'm feeling daring.
Wow. And if you twist it, if you always twist it in the same direction like this, then what happens is you get a lot of twist in your yarn, and then you have to kind of let it untwist later. So if you can remember, twist it like this one time, and then the next time you have to twist it, you can twist it in the opposite direction, and that'll kind of take that extra twist out of your 2 strands of yarn you're working with. Okay, anything else? Any other questions?
And this would be a technique you'd use at like the top of the chart here, where you've got sort of the little bits on the top of the chess pieces that are a little bit far apart, right?
Yes. So when I made this sample here, it's not so bad for the most part because you have all these pieces are spaced out nicely together. But even right here, from here to here, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I would go ahead and twist probably right in here. Let's see if we can find out where I did the twist. And yeah, so you can see right here is where I did the twist. So the gray is twisted right around that white to keep the float from being so long. And then here I didn't twist because it's almost could have had a twist, but you know, if I were really making a sweater, I may have put the twist in, but because I knew it was a swatch, I probably didn't go let it bother me so much. But up here, let's look at the front. So the horse is shorter, so you don't have any white going up here. So you have a lot of stitches between these 2 tall pieces. I don't know, are they supposed to be a bishop or what are they supposed to be, Claire? Do you know?
Oh, that's a good question because I don't play chess.
I don't play chess either. So, but anyway, so from here to here, you don't want to strand your white that far because that is going to be a rather long float and it's going to cause problems in the long run. When you have really long floats, it tends to be easy to let them be pulled too tight, and then it's going to cause your work to pucker in like that, just because it's not going to allow it to stretch at all. So you don't want to let the float be too long. And as you can see here, I added some twist. I probably could have put one right there, but so right here and here and here and here, and that keeps the strand from being too long. Okay, any questions about that? Were you able to see that? So
Erica came to our rescue. That was indeed a bishop.
right. It's a miracle.
We did have a question. When you're twisting, should you twist on the 5th stitch or on the stitch after the 5th one, aka the 6th?
You know, It just depends on how you're feeling about it. As Claire said, sometimes she'll go to the sixth stitch. You can twist before or after the fifth. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's kind of a personal preference. I usually do it after the third or fourth one. Um, it's just depending on how long your floats are going to be. So, any other class? I mean, other questions?
We have a couple questions because the little swatch there looks so much like Intarsia. And so, I mean, you probably could do this all in Intarsia if you wanted to. You just have to manage more little working bits of yarn, which could be easier, could be harder. Um, and then we did have a question from Judy. She said she took an Intarsia class, and when starting a new color, they were told to put the old color over the new color. I think that's just to prevent the hole between, like if you've got a line of two colors meeting up and changing at exact same point.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that too here in a minute, because as you see, we do have some straight lines here. Okay. Yeah, you could do this type of technique with Intarsia as well. And with Intarsia, I don't want to get into it too much, but you have little bobbins right with each color. So you would have to have wouldn't you, Claire, have to have a bobbin for each one of these chess pieces? And then you just don't end up with the long strands as much. So, but that's another class for another day. But it does look very similar, especially when it's flat. It does look very similar to Intarsia. Okay, so no questions. I want to move on to like looking at the chart. Any questions at all?
I think our next question is leading us right into that. Celia wants to know, do we follow the pattern on the purl side?
Very good question. Okay, so let's look at and talk a little bit just about basic chart reading, and then we'll look at it, how it applies to this pattern. So charts, each one of these squares counts as a stitch. So we've got a white square and then a gray square.
Hey, Darren.
Yes?
Could you zoom in a little bit or hold the paper closer?
Try to hold it closer. Okay. So what happens is each one of these squares counts as a stitch. And every time it changes color, then you're supposed to change color as well. And if you're going to do your sweater in like red and white or blue and green or different colors, then you just decide like red's going to be the background and black's going to be the chess piece. And then you'll just follow accordingly. Sometimes if there's a lot of different colors in the pattern, you want to have this printed in color, because otherwise you can't tell at all which color you're supposed to be doing. So, but for if it's just two colors, then this is a very nice way to do it. It's fine in black and white. So I followed the chart for this square here. And very important you want to look at is this chart has 20 stitches. So it's a 20 stitch repeat. So you want to make sure that you have the appropriate number of stitches. So if you cast on exactly what they tell you to and you manage your stitches all correctly, you'll be fine. But if you cast on an extra stitch for some reason, or if you drop a stitch, then you're going to be in trouble. And you'll find out soon enough when you start working the chart. These numbers are very important, and they tell you where you're supposed to start reading the chart. And this has a number 1 right along the bottom. So you start there. So you're going to start here. The first 2 rows of this chart are just solid colors gray. So you work all the way across in gray. You move up to the next row and you work all the way back in gray. Now, you want to make sure that you are always knitting on the knit side and purling on the purl side. So if you're on the right side of your work, which will be the knit sides, make sure you're knitting. And if you're on the back side of your work, which will be the purl side in this case, you want to make sure you're purling. So you want to look at your knitting and make sure you're reading your stitches correctly. Also, once we get started with the stranding, you do want to make sure that you're always keeping your strands on the back side of your work, on the purl side. So don't let them move to the front by mistake. It would be an easy mistake to make, but yeah, make sure that they're all on the back side. Okay. So we finish row 1, we finish row 2, then you move up to row 3. You're going to do 2 gray, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 white. And then I would probably do a twist somewhere right about in the middle. And then you're going to do 3 gray, 7 white, and 1 gray. You move up to number 4, and then you come back across doing it the same way. So I'm going to show you a few little tricks. I have a swatch started. I will tell you this, when I'm coming across here and I twist my work right here to catch my float, probably do it right here up. I'm not going to do it in the exact same spot. I'm going to do it maybe here, or maybe here, or maybe here and here. You don't want to always line them up on the exact same spot, or else they tend to show in the front. So that's a little something I've noticed. It happens to me anyway. Claire, does that happen to you, or have you noticed that?
It will happen if you've got, like, you know, a big straight line of stitches there, because since you're switching colors, they aren't actually connected at that point, and so they don't want to hold hands. They don't want to stay together.
Yeah, so yeah, I always kind of stagger when I'm catching my float. I kind of stagger it a bit. I don't like to line them straight up. So, and another problem you're going to have is this straight line here, here, here. All of these straight lines are going to cause you a problem. And I'm going to show you now how to kind of work through that problem, show you a few little tricks that I have. So today in class, I'm working with this yarn called TRUBOO.
We had one question on the chart, Darren.
Okay.
On the chart, are the even rows purl or wrong side rows, and the odd rows are knit rows, or is it the opposite?
You know, I think the odd ones are the knit side, but the most important thing, like you can remember knit is the odd or the even, but you want to make sure you're living real life. And when I say you're really living real life, if you think you're on the knit side and you're purling, that's fine and dandy, but you want to look at it and make sure what's really happening in reality. So it doesn't really matter. I mean, it does matter kind of, but just make sure the thing you want to remember is if you are on the knit side, looking at knit stitches, make sure you're knitting. And if you're on the purl side, looking at purl stitches, make sure you're purling. Does that help or not?
I just want to point out, it does say in the actual sweater pattern, and it switches between the 2 smaller charts and the 3 larger charts as to whether an odd row is a right side or a wrong side row. But it does say in the actual text of the pattern, just not here on the chart page.
Because here you have 1 on the opposite side, and here you have 1 on these 2 sides. So just make sure you're always looking at your work and reading it. And if you feel like you should be purling and you're looking at your work and you're on the right side, then something's off. You want to put your work down and kind of refer back to your pattern in your chart and see exactly where you are. So sometimes it's easy to get kind of mixed up or lost in your work. And put it down, take a quick little break, and then reevaluate what you're doing.
And the common convention for charts is that the numbers on the right side of the chart will be on the right side of the fabric.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yep.
I never knew that. So that kind of answers our question then. So this is the right side of the chart. That should be on the right side of the fabric, but that's going to be kind of weird with this one.
I think it's probably because you've got like some plain rows on the top and the bottom there. So there's like a dividing pattern in between, I think.
There's always a reason. So yeah, that's a great way to look at it. So if what's on the right side is going to be on the right side of your fabric, then the even one will be on the right side, and here it'll be the odd ones. Yeah, I never heard that before, Claire. That's good. So for class today, I'm using these I'm using Lion Brand TRUBOO for my swatch. And that's available on lionbrand.com or michaels.com. And it's always very important to have some stitch markers handy. Okay, so I am going to join, let me see if I can raise this up a smidge. I'm going to join my white here in a second. Now, I cast on for my practice swatch 28 stitches. So I would have a little edge. I didn't want to have to do Fair Isle clear up to the very edge. So I'm going to knit 4 stitches for my salvage edge, and this is just for my practice swatch. And then I'm going to put a stitch marker on. Now I always like to work with stitch markers when I'm doing a chart because when I get to the end of this repeat, let's say I'm working this row here and I get to the end of it and I'm thinking 3 white, 2 black, and I get to the end and it matches up, I know I'm fine. But if I get to the end here and I'm thinking, okay, 3 more white and 2 black, but then in real life, I have 3 white and 3 black or something, then I know I've made a mistake. I've made the mistake inside that repeat, so between those 2 stitch markers, and I can kind of go back and reevaluate. I don't have to, kind of go back and work my way through the entire sweater. You can just, if every other repeat matched up nicely, then you know they're fine. And the one you're working on now is not matching up nicely, then you know that mistake is just within those 20 stitches. So I recommend using stitch markers because you don't want to get to the very end of your row. You might have 50 stitches and find out something went wrong, and now you have to unknit the whole row to figure it out. So that's never fun. So, I like a stitch marker. Okay, so it's here. I'm going to start right here. So I'm going to do 1 gray and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 white. And one thing you can do if you want to, so you don't have to count them each time, and just make sure you can write a number 7 in there with a pencil to kind of help keep track of where you are. All right, so 1 gray. Do you use stitch markers, Claire, like that or no?
Sometimes. It is very helpful when you do have the stitch markers like that.
So now I'm going to add my white.
Do you have another light, Darren? It's just very dark down at the bottom of the screen by your hand.
Adjust it. I'm going to set this out of the way for just a minute while I'm doing this. Is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Again, if anyone has a lighting director they'd like to send over, I would be very happy for the help. Okay, so I entered my stitch and I'm just going to put my white on my needle and I'm going to start knitting with my white. So 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to twist mine now. And I just do it like that. That's it. But I do want to make my stitch. So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, and it's not a bad idea to kind of just look at it, make sure everything looks nice. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I'm good. So now I'm going to use my gray. So there's 3 gray stitches. So I don't have to do a twist because it's only 3. And now when I'm switching colors, here's where you don't want to let this kind of scrunch up because then your float will only have that much room when in reality, it needs that much room. So you want to let your fabric kind of flow nicely in your hand. Use the white. So 1, 2, 3, let's do 4. Oh, let's do 5. Normally I would balance these out and kind of put it in the middle, but you can go 5 and then just give it a little twist. 6, 7. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then finish with my 2 gray. And that is the end of my repeat. So I'm going to pop the stitch marker on so I know where it ends. And then just knit this little salvage edge. And that's pretty much how you work it going across. And I'm going to work my way back here in a second, but does anyone have any questions at all? And then at the end of each row, I like to kind of go back and look at it. And it doesn't look like much now, but later on, you'll start to see it taking shape, and you know you're making chess pieces. You kind of know what they should look like. You can look at your chart, and if it looks like it's going on a diagonal, or you've got one crazy white stitch or gray stitch where you shouldn't, now's a nice time to fix it. You know, you don't want to wait until you've, gone on 3 or 4 rows, okay? So now I'm knitting flat, so I'm going to turn my work. And this gives me an opportunity to kind of examine my floats to make sure everything's looking nice. So I'm going to purl back because I'm working stockinette stitch. When you get to your marker, just slip your marker. And then, okay, let's look at the chart here to show you how this is. So what I did was I worked across here. And now I'm going to go up and I'm going to work back across. So 2 gray. And you don't really have to look at your chart for this one because the first 3 rows are exactly the same. So you kind of know that the first 3 rows are exactly the same. Now, if I just leave my gray down and switch to the white, what's going to happen is you can see here, it's going to create a big hole. And not just because I have a new strand, but because it's not connected. And that might be okay if you're just doing it for 1 row, but we're doing it for 3 rows. And so I don't want to do it that way. So what you do is you enter the stitch, just like you were starting it. And then I just put a twist in my yarn. Is that showing up? I'm never sure if it looks right on camera. So I just put a twist in my yarn like that and go back to my white. And that way it kind of connects the white and the gray together. You have that piece of yarn kind of bridging that gap and holding it together. And it's kind of similar what you do here, catching a float. So I'm going to catch my float. And then again on this side. So you want to make sure that you're joining those together. So you twist them, and now I'm switching to the gray. And at this point, I'd probably stop, stretch my work out so it's not bunched up, give it a little snug, and I can look at my floats. And I can see here I've caught my gray one twice, and it looks very nice. And so I'm ready to go forward. So I'm going to switch to the white. And so I'm going to twist them so that I'm locking that white and that gray together so it's not creating a hole. And then I want to twist them to create that float so that I'm not having long strands. And after this row, we'll take questions because there's a lot happening. Okay. And now I'm going to switch back to my gray. So I'm going to twist them to lock them in place. So as you can see, I'm not as good at knitting Fair Isle flat as I would be knitting it in the round. And what I'm tending to do is dropping my strands of yarn and only working with one at a time and not holding them both in my hand at the same time. Because the way the purl is constructed, it just seems more comfortable for me to do it that way. I don't have a lot of experience knitting Fair Isle flat. So let's talk a little bit about why some people really do like knitting Fair Isle flat. So first, I'm going to make sure and see if you have any questions before we move on. Any questions about this at all?
We do have some questions.
Yeah.
Marley wants to know, do you have to twist the gray and white for every row or only on the first time?
You have to twist. I would do it at least every other row. So here, like I didn't twist them when I did the first row. And then the second row, I did twist them. And I would probably twist them on the next row, but you only have to do that when you're creating a straight line. So like right here. So when you're creating the straight line. And then this first row here, you won't have to at all because you're not creating a straight line. But coming back here and here, you should twist them. And on this side, you don't have to here, but here you do. So whenever you're making a straight line, would you do it here, Claire, or would you kind of let that fly?
No, I would probably let that go.
Yeah, you can sometimes if there's just two, what is your rule, Claire? Do you do it on 3?
Yeah, on 3, and then you can do it sort of like in that middle row so things stay together.
Yeah, so you can just see how your work is working out, but if there's just 2 creating a straight line, you might not have to twist it because the float does go behind it and it will kind of hold it together, but I probably would twist it there. So it's kind of a personal preference. Now, right here where you have 4, you definitely want to, and you could do every other row. You don't have to do each one, but I probably would do each one, but you don't really have to. Claire would probably do every other one?
Yeah, I would do every other one.
Yeah. So it's really a personal preference. I don't think there's a right or a wrong, but you just want to make sure you're not pulling it too tight and that it feels comfortable in your hand. And then at the end of the row, after you finish the whole row, you want to lay it down and look at it on the right side and make sure everything is laying flat and looks nice. So that's going to be the judge of how you're doing it. And if you're only doing it every other one or every third row, check and see if there is a hole. And if there's not a hole, then you're good to go. So any other questions?
I just want to clarify that's for the twists when you've got like a line where you're changing colors. It's not twisting like when you're catching floats, because that would be something you do within that long stretch of white.
Yeah, so twisting to catch a float would be done here, like in a long stretch of white. And twisting to seal up that edge would be kind of more of a vertical situation where you're creating a straight line. So in a different project, you might have a straight line going up like 40 rows. You know, if you're doing like letters or spelling out words, or maybe there's a house, there could be a tree. I mean, any number of things. It could go up, up, and up. So that's just the way you want to make sure you're doing that. It's nice to practice on these little motifs before you go on to something huge then. Anything else?
And Liz had mentioned that she'd heard the term color dominance and wanted to know a little bit more about that.
All right,
I think,
so what? Go ahead.
go ahead, go ahead.
So if you want to make sure you're always holding the colors in your hand the same way. And so if you have white and gray and you're holding them in your hand, let's say like this, when you're knitting, you want to make sure you're always holding them the same way. So I have the gray on the top. So you want to always make sure the gray is on the top, because it will make one color will stand out more than the other color. And if you switch halfway through, it's going to look quite different, and it'll really show that you've switched something up. So here, see how I have the gray is on the top. And then now I'm going to put my white, and see the white is on the bottom. But if you change that, if I randomly change it to this, then one color will be dominant and the other color will kind of fall to the background. And if you keep switching it up, then it's going to make your piece look really funny. Does that help?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah. Okay. Claire, I always get it mixed up. Which one is the more dominant one? Is it the one on the top or the bottom?
Oh,
I
think it is the color you carry on top.
Okay, yeah, I think so. But yeah, but the main thing is, once you've decided, don't switch it. And it might be a fun experiment to do in a swatch. So I would always do a swatch before I start a Fair Isle project to make sure that you have, a good color contrast, to make sure that you like working with the yarn. And then halfway through your swatch, switch which one's on top and on bottom, and see which one you like better. So start off knowing which way you're doing it, switch halfway through, and then you can evaluate and see which one is more dominant and which one looks better for your project. Okay. Anything else? Question?
I'm going to give you a time check because all of a sudden we have less than 15 minutes left.
No, right? We've covered quite a bit though. We've covered a lot. So does anyone, before we move on, have any questions? We've covered a lot, so there might be. No?
We've got one question about weaving in ends if we've got time at the end of class.
Okay, we can look at that. Just double checking my notes. Okay, so some reasons why people there's always more than one way of accomplishing the same task. And some people like certain ways and some people like other ways. Usually both ways are good, but you might like one way more than another way. So this hat was created knitting in the round. And so you're never turning your work. You're always looking at the front of your work. You're not doing any purls. And so it makes it in my personal opinion, it makes it a lot easier to work the Fair Isle if you're only working on the right side. Couple of drawbacks though. So let me see if I can find a good, clear example. So right here, you can see there's these 5 stitches that kind of make an X going all the way around. And so you go all the way around, you're making your 5 stitches, it's creating this nice kind of an X shape until you get right here. Now what happened here? Like, why is that not, can you see that? Why is that a nice X and that a nice X, but this one is not? And then if you go right up above that, why does that kind of look a little different than the ones on each side of it? So what happens is when you start your round, you go around, and when you finish your round, you're always going to have a little bit of a problem like that. It's never going to line up perfectly. And the reason is you start out here going all the way around, and then when you come back, you don't end here, you end here. It's a spiral. So you're finishing that whole row. And then when you make it back to here, you've done that whole row. So now you're one row above. So it's never going to line up perfectly when you're doing Fair Isle in the round. When you're doing Fair Isle flat, you will be able to manage all that by when you seam it together, you can line everything up perfectly in the seams. So that's one positive thing about, see, this doesn't bother me, but that might really bother someone. So, but you can keep your, there's no jog. They kind of call that a jog. And sometimes you'll even get a stripe. Like, let me kind of pull it here. So you can kind of see here, that's the jog right there. And it doesn't look as smooth and nice as some people may like. So if you have a seam, you can hide that in the seam and everything will match up perfectly. When you're knitting a sweater, so pretend this is a sweater, or let's look at this little baby sweater I have. So I made this little baby sweater. I did it in the round. If you want to have a cardigan, so a cardigan has the opening in the front. So you can't knit a cardigan in the round, right? Because you want to have that opening in the front. You don't want to join it. So in Fair Isle, the tradition is you build in an extra few stitches in the middle. And then after you're done knitting it, you take a pair of scissors and you cut right up the front and open it up. And that's called steeking. And you don't just cut it like willy-nilly. You do prepare along each edge. You kind of sew it in place so that it doesn't unravel. But once you cut this open, then you fold those edges under and sew them down. And then you can put on a button band or a zipper or whatever. But that enables you to knit this all the way in the round without working on the purl side, and also creating it into a cardigan. So there's techniques for doing that. Some people hate that. Some people are not going to want to do that. So if you knit it flat, that's the alternative. Also, if this is knitted in the round, you don't have any seams. So there's no side seam here at all. And it's not so bad for a pullover, but when you open it up and make a cardigan, because there are no side seams, if it's like an adult size sweater, sometimes it doesn't hang quite as nice as you might want it to. So knitting it flat and then seaming it will allow you to build in those side seams, and that helps to give your garment structure. So sometimes that helps it to hang a little better. It gives it more structure. What do you think about that, Claire? Do you like that idea or no?
I think that's a good point about the structure versus no structure.
And then some people do get a better tension knitting it flat and over knitting it in the round. And I think that is because when you're knitting it in the round and you're only ever looking at the front, we do tend to forget that there is another side. So there are two sides to every story, right? So when you're knitting on the front, you're having such a good time and everything's looking so nice, you forget there's a whole other story happening on the other side. And you might not be managing your floats as carefully as you should be. But when you're knitting flat, if you're doing Fair Isle flat, you go across and then you turn your work to knit back, and it's forcing you to look at your floats and to make sure that you're managing them nicely. And that's also going to remind you to keep your tension nice and even. And if you see, say like this float was really tight and it was causing it to pucker right there, then you might be able to go back and fix it before, now I've bound off, it'd be too late. But if I was like just like one row above, you could unknit that row and go back and fix it if you needed to. So that's another reason, because it does help to give you a little bit, it can help give you a little more even tension. Now I'm going to be honest, I really prefer knitting it in the round. When I made this swatch, I was so happy every time my purl side was done and I could knit on the front. So that's just me, but I do like to encourage people to try all different ways, because there are certain things in knitting that I absolutely hate doing and refuse to do. And other people love those things and it's their favorite thing. So there's always more than one way to accomplish the same task. And the more ways you know, the better prepared you are for any project. Which way do you like better, Claire?
I have done both, but I think I do tend to knit Fair Isle in the round. If I was doing it in like an all over garment, I might do it flat then because, like you mentioned, the patterning at the side, it's nice when that lines up.
Yeah.
And then with this pattern, it's nice to have it flat because of the yarn, and those side seams help give it structure.
Yeah. Yeah, the bamboo might tend to stretch a little bit. And so those side seams giving it the structure are going to help it hold its shape much nicer. So, but it's a very nice, smooth yarn. It's nice to work with. So, any other, that's pretty much all I have for today. Did I finish early? That's never happened before.
I was going to say we had one question if we had time, and since we do, Tina had a question about how you weave in the tails on the white when you've just joined it there to start your color work.
Okay, so if we want to switch back, okay. So weaving in the ends, it's always a bit of a chore. I really don't hate it, but some people really don't like it. In Fair Isle, you have, let me see if I have I did have a needle. I have a needle handy. With Fair Isle, it's a little harder because you can't really see. Um, like usually you could just go ahead and weave it in, but because the floats are covering it up, it does make it a little harder. But you just weave them in pretty much the same way you normally would. You want to make sure you're not distorting the front. So I would probably take it under, maybe take it under these 2 stitches just to kind of get me started. And then just kind of pull it up. When I weave in, and I know there's other ways of doing it, people do it other ways. I just like to weave it in and out of these purl bumps. And always weave it in on the color. Don't weave, like you wouldn't want to weave the white in on the gray. So I just kind of go down through the purl bumps like that. And kind of massage it out a little bit. Double check the front and make sure you're not distorting the front. And then just kind of go under that float and weave in a couple more. So there's a little bit of a white bit here so you can see what you're doing nicely. But the most important thing when you're weaving in ends, you do kind of want to go in one direction and then back across the other direction. You want to weave it in about 2 inches, 2 to 3 inches total. You don't want it to distort the front of your work at all. And it should be very lightly done. You don't want to pull it tight. If you pull it tight, you can really kind of mess things up from the front. And then double check, make sure you're not distorting. So if you pull it really tight, see how it kind of causes it to pucker. But if you catch it right away, you can kind of massage it out a little bit. Okay. So any other questions about weaving in ends? You pretty much do it the same way you would any other project. But because the floats are kind of blocking your view, it does make it a little harder. You just have to be a little more patient. Any questions about that at all?
Nothing so far coming up in the chat. Oh, Cindy wants to know what was the 2 or 3 inches referring to?
Okay, so you don't want to just like weave in, let's say this is the beginning of where I'm weaving. You don't just want to weave in like 2 or 3 stitches and only have that much woven in. You want to weave in about that much of your yarn. So you kind of go across and then back and then maybe down and across, and depending on where you can get in there. But if this were, let's say, weaving in the gray, this gray bit, because there's so much gray, I would probably just take the gray down this right down here and maybe go over and then up this one. So that's going to be about 2 inches all the way around, or maybe across and up to that one. So you just don't want it to pull out. So does that help?
Yeah, the
Yeah, always,
zigzagging is the key.
yeah, and then just double check and make sure you're not distorting anything on the front, and then you'll be fine. And if you do it and it doesn't look nice, it's easy to pull it out. Like before you snip that end off, that's why fold it over, look at it, make sure everything looks nice. If it doesn't look nice, take your darning needle and just kind of pick it back out and then give it another try. It's not hard and you won't hurt anything. Anything else?
I'm going to put the link to the pattern and the pattern PDF in the chat here one more time.
And if you have any other questions or if you run into any problems, you can send me a message on either Instagram or TikTok. And my username on there is Mr. Woolly Bear, M-I-S-T-E-R spelled out, Woolly Bear. Maybe Claire will put that in the chat. And on Facebook, it's just my name. So if you just find my name on Facebook, you can send me a message. So if you need help, I can answer questions. Sometimes it's just nice to get a quick answer to something. So, all right. Okay, so if there's nothing else, thanks for coming to class. Just practice and you'll get better every time you practice. You'll get a little better each time.